Hello, I'm Tom Kimmel. Ms. Coate, thank you for that effusive, inflated, hyperbolic introduction that I provided for you. Stay with me, folks. I promise you an investigation. Some facts you have never heard before, some free stuff, and hopefully some fun along the way. After all, it's my job this morning to talk and your job to listen. Should you finish before I do, then God bless you. Hopefully I'll get my dogs to quit barking as well. Okay, here's my website and here's my email address. That's my grandfather when I knew him well. And to the right is my grandfather when he was Commander-in-Chief of the Pacific Fleet on December 7th, 1941, when the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor. Folks, the Pearl Harbor story boils down to almost everyone in Washington versus the Hawaiian Command. Kimmel in short. The important exception is Captain Lawrence Safford in Washington, D.C., the head of Naval Communications Intelligence in Washington, D.C., who dared to tell the truth, and without whom there is no Pearl Harbor story as we know it today. Notwithstanding the preceding, the Pearl Harbor story today still boils down to Washington versus Kimmel and Short. This graphic depicts the notable characters in the Pearl Harbor story. By no means all of them, but the principal characters. Today, I'm going to present to the Monroe, Georgia High School a Pearl Harbor attack presentation, the first of 6. And this is it. The presentation today, this morning, is about fixing responsibility for the success of the Japanese attack at Pearl Harbor. So, let's plunge in to the murky depths of Pearl Harbor. And with the help of my dogs, Josie and Lily, here we go. But first, let's fix responsibility. Let's cut to the chase. Let's be clear. Make no mistake. What we are here to do today is to fix responsibility for the success of the Pearl Harbor attack. To do so, I have found this exercise to be useful, as too often the government uses the term responsibility more to obfuscate than to enlighten. Consider this. Ms. Coate is responsible for having me here today, in the same sense that Admiral Kimmel, my grandfather, and General Short were responsible in Pearl Harbor, in the sense that she had to properly respond to everything she knew in getting me here today. She's also accountable in the same sense that Admiral Kimmel and General Short were accountable in Hawaii, in the sense that she had to properly account for everything she did and did not do in getting me here today. So what have we learned? Well, I would suggest we haven't learned much. What's important is to determine whether or not Ms. Coate is blamable for having me here today. And ultimately, for you to decide in the audience, should she be punished for having me here today? Okay. What are we really talking about here? Here's what.
September 1941. Naval intelligence in Tokyo sends a message to secret agent Yoshikawa, living in Pearl Harbor.
Strictly secret. From now on, we would like to have you make reports to President. With regards to warships, aircraft carriers, we would like to have you report on those at anchor, tied up at wharves and in docks.
On 7th of December 1941, Japan launches a daring strike. Planes from a massive armada surprise the U.S. Pacific Fleet at Pearl Harbor. The attack is captured on color film by American serviceman flying with his own camera. For the last 60 years, the original color of this badly faded print has gone unnoticed until now. This is the first time it has been broadcast in color. For 2 hours, 350 planes pound the American ships. The Japanese pilots sink or badly damage 8 battleships, 3 cruisers, and several other smaller ships. Only 29 Japanese planes are lost. Over 2,400 Americans are killed. The news of a great victory at Pearl Harbor is announced early in the morning. The new Prime Minister, General Hideki Tojo.
The key to success lies in a faith in victory. For 2,600 years since it was founded, our empire has never known a defeat. It is time for the 100 million of us Japanese to sacrifice everything for our country's cause.
Housewife Tei Fujiwara.
I was so surprised.
Saying, becoming a prisoner is inexcusable, even when we are unarmed. To bite with teeth and fight to the last is the Japanese spirit.
Anybody know the words to this tune? On the sea. That's the Navy hymn that the Navy football team ends their football games with, if you've ever seen one. Okay, who am I and why am I here? This is my first ship out of the Naval Academy, 1966. 1968, well, we went back and forth from 1968 to Vietnam and the gun line. But in 1968, we also wound up in North Korea on the 38th parallel when they took the USS Pueblo. You might recall that. It was a U.S. spy ship, communication ship that the North Koreans seized. On the Taussig, we spent 45 days going back and forth south of the 38th parallel, shadowing a Soviet frigate that was doing the same thing just north of the 38th parallel. This is my second ship out of the Naval Academy. I was chief engineer of this ship. And I don't mind telling you, I had a little problem with seasickness. But we rounded the Cape of Good Hope during a colossal storm. One of the few times I experienced no seasickness. Too scared to be seasick. It's my third ship out of the Naval Academy. I was a first lieutenant on this ship. We went back and forth to Vietnam a couple of times and brought back mechanized battalions of Marines. One notable experience in Da Nang, we're alongside the pier picking up the Marines. All of a sudden I heard the rat-a-tat-tat of a M14. No one told me that that was a Marine sentry firing into the river there to discourage sappers. Took me a while to calm down after I found all that out. Okay, this represents my 25 years in the FBI, another year and a half on contract. And I can say about this, with great memory, my first arrest, which I'll share with you. I was given a fugitive case. We found the fugitive. It was in Cleveland. It was cold. It was my case. We found the fugitive. We went into his apartment. He was in bed. I yanked him out of bed. I was so nervous, handcuffed him behind his back, and proceeded to lead him outside into the Cleveland cold when he suddenly stopped me and said, "Hey, man, it's cold out there." And for the first time, I noticed he was stark naked. I recovered from that, and the arrest ended without incident. Later on, however, years later, we had the horrible case of finding fugitive Melvin Bay Guyon out of Cleveland. We found him in Youngstown, Ohio. In Cleveland, he had murdered an FBI agent friend of mine. For 2 weeks, we conducted an enormous search, found Melvin eventually in Youngstown. We knew he was going to be at a phone booth at a certain hour, so we set up to make the arrest. Part of the arrest plan was to have a little truck, a van loaded with FBI agents, go up to the phone booth and just kiss the phone booth so that after he got in there, he would be trapped like a fish in a goldfish pond. Well, we got a little excited, the driver did, and instead of just kissing the phone booth door, We hit the phone booth door at about 30 miles an hour and sheared off the foundation bolts of the phone booth. It slid across the macadam. The centrifugal force of the phone booth spun Melvin Bay Guyon, who was a high school track star, out of the phone booth, and he took off at track star speed. It was at night, and he ran smack into an oak tree, knocked out his 2 front teeth, and broke his nose. We later found him. He was at the hospital. There's more to the story, but suffice it to say, we filed a report, and the arrest was made without incident. Okay. Here's why I'm here. That's my grandfather, Admiral Kimmel. And that's General Short, who was the head of the Hawaiian Command when Pearl Harbor was attacked on December 7th, 1941. There's a story within the Pearl Harbor story. It's the story of a nation under attack, to be sure, for 5 years, and a man for 76 years and counting. That man is my grandfather, Admiral Kimmel. Here's part of the story. That's my dad there, age 5. He was in the Naval Academy in 1936. My grandfather, Admiral Kimmel, Naval Academy class of 1904. My dad's older brother, my Uncle Manning, class of 1935 at the Naval Academy. And here is my great-grandfather, Admiral Kimmel's father, Marius Manning Kimmel, West Point, class of 1857. As you've probably figured out already, perilously close to the Civil War. And indeed, Marius Manning Kimmel fought the first battle of Bull Run, or Manassas, if you prefer, for the United States Army. He was from Kentucky. After the battle, he resigned his commission, went back to Kentucky, considered his options, and he opted to fight the rest of the war for the Confederate States Army, and fight he did. He fought at Vicksburg, Holly Springs, Corinth, Pea Ridge, and a host of other lesser engagements, and miraculously survived the war. Or we would not be having this conversation today. These are my father's submarines during World War II. As you can see, here's a Japanese round that went through Burgall. My dad was eventually commanding officer of Burgall. That round went right through the pressure hull of Burgall, which meant she couldn't submerge anymore. A submarine that can't submerge is a sitting duck. Here's my dad's older brother. He was on drum during the Battle of Midway. The Battle of Midway was the most important naval battle in the history of the American Republic. He was the executive officer of Rattan. That's the number 2 officer aboard. Rattan, interestingly enough, was the only American submarine ever to be attacked by another American submarine in World War II. 2 torpedoes bounced off of Rattan, delivered by Lapon. But the torpedoes in the early part of the war didn't work, so Rattan survived. My uncle was promoted to commanding officer of Robles. He went to sea and was never heard from again. Interestingly enough, the Chief of Naval Operations, Admiral King, suspended the Naval Court of Inquiry proceedings. This was against my grandfather, for 1 day, in deference to the loss of his oldest son, Manning Kimmel. We don't know much about his loss because nothing was ever recovered. Okay, consider this. That's my mother, Nancy. Prior to the Pearl Harbor attack, this picture was taken. They lived in Medan, Sumatra. We knew that the Japanese were going to take Sumatra. So prior to the Pearl Harbor attack, My mother's mother, Bernice, her sister Mary, and sister Sue were evacuated from Sumatra. The word went out, the order went out, women and children were to be evacuated. So they went to Australia. My mother, however, was still in Medan, Sumatra after the Pearl Harbor attack. My grandfather, maternal grandfather, Will, made arrangements for her to be evacuated to Cilacap, Java, where she was with many school children. My great-grandfather, Will, was a planter of rubber trees and an educator. He ran a school in Medan, Sumatra. My mother, Nancy, was to take a handful of these school children out of harm's way, and she did, with several hairbreadth escapes, which I don't have time to go into today. Suffice it to say, Lynn, my mother's brother, age 16, was not considered a child, so he was not evacuated. My grandfather, Will, obviously he stayed. Nenda, my mother's mother, my great-grandmother, refused to be evacuated. So Lynn, Will, and Nenda spent the war, the entire war, as prisoners of war of the Japanese. So you might consider, gentlemen, ladies too, consider not only being a prisoner of war for the entire war, but being a prisoner of war with your grandmother, even as nice as she might be. Okay, time to investigate. So now, from the audience, I need 2 volunteers. One to role play Admiral Stark, and one to role play General Marshall. Let me get a couple of volunteers here. Okay, thank you. All right, let's get started. We need to get serious here. Admiral Kimmel was appointed Commander-in-Chief of the Pacific Fleet on February 1st, 1941. 17 days after he took the job, he wrote a letter to his boss, his only uniformed boss in the Navy, Admiral Stark, in which he said, I, Admiral Kimmel, have recently been told by an officer fresh from Washington, D.C., that the Office of Naval Intelligence considers it the function of operations to furnish me, the Commander-in-Chief of the Pacific, with information of a secret nature. I have also heard that operations considers the responsibility for furnishing the same type of information to be that of the Office of Naval Intelligence. Admiral Stark, I do not know that we have missed anything out here in the Pacific, but if there is any doubt as to whose responsibility it is to keep the Commander-in-Chief, me, Admiral Kimmel, fully informed with pertinent reports of subjects that should be of interest to the fleet, will you kindly fix that responsibility so there will be no misunderstanding? Admiral Kimmel received a hollow assurance from Admiral Stark. Not satisfied with that letter, he wrote another letter in June of 1941 to his only boss in the Navy, Admiral Stark, in which Admiral Kimmel said, Admiral Stark, the Commander-in-Chief of the Pacific Fleet, is in a very difficult position. He is far removed from the seat of government. He is not informed as to the policy reflected in current events. Accordingly, it is suggested that it be made a cardinal principle that the Commander-in-Chief of the Pacific Fleet be immediately informed of all important developments as they occur and by the quickest secure means available. Kimmel received another hollow assurance from Admiral Stark. Receiving hollow assurances from Admiral Stark was not all that Kimmel did during his June visit to Washington, D.C., where Kimmel delivered that letter that I just apprised you of to Admiral Stark, hand-delivered it. In June of 1941, Admiral Kimmel not only met with Admiral Stark, but he met with the President of the United States. He made notes, which are on file, from that meeting with the president. He met the president with his war plans officer, his operations officer, McMorris. The notes say, in the end, Kimmel brought to the president's attention a clear picture of the existing situation at Pearl Harbor, defense arrangements, etc. In 1944, Admiral Kimmel testified under oath to the Naval Court of Inquiry. Admiral Kimmel, had an interview with President Roosevelt in June of 1941, and the substantial point of the conversation that was, so far as an air attack on Pearl Harbor is concerned, the only real answer to an air attack was not to have the fleet in port if and when an air attack came. In 1946, Kimmel, under oath, testified to the Joint Congressional Committee. I told the president that the only answer to an attack on the fleet in Pearl Harbor was not to have the fleet in there. In 1954, Kimmel wrote a book in which he said that the deficiencies of Pearl Harbor as a fleet base were well known in the Navy Department. In an interview with Mr. Roosevelt in June 1941 in Washington, I outlined the weaknesses and concluded with a remark that the only answer was to have the fleet at sea if the Japanese ever attacked. Okay, this is a good time to tell you something about magic. You can't have any understanding of the Pearl Harbor story without having some understanding of magic, and there'll be much more on magic in my presentation number 2, class 2 here. Definition of magic. Magic was a code word for the secret American decoding of Japanese diplomatic and spy communications. Magic provided indications prior to the Pearl Harbor attack of the time, place, reason, and deceit planned to cover the attack. Hawaii, meaning Kimmel in short, had no magic. Washington, D.C., Manila, meaning General Marshall in the Philippines, and Admiral Hart, Commander-in-Chief of the Asiatic Fleet, and the British, they all had magic. But Admiral Kimmel and General Short had no magic. And, interestingly enough, the man that President Roosevelt designated as in charge of internal security, J. Edgar Hoover, the head of the FBI, he didn't have any magic either. And the man that President Roosevelt designated as in charge of external security, William Donovan, the coordinator of information, the precursor of the Office of Strategic Services, think CIA, he didn't have any magic either. We have come to learn, however, that the Soviets had access to magic, but that's for another story. Time to conduct the investigation I promised you earlier. How to start? Anybody? All right. How about we get the Chief of Naval Operations on the stand, Admiral Stark, the head of the Navy, place him under oath, and proceed to interrogate him. And that's precisely what the Joint Congressional Committee, the General Counsel, William Mitchell, did. And he asked Admiral Stark, who was it, Admiral, that told you that they had a system out in Honolulu or Pearl Harbor of decoding and encrypting Japanese messages, meaning magic? Took Admiral Stark about 2 nanoseconds to cough up his operations head, Admiral Turner. Okay, so what's the next step in the investigation? Anybody? Yeah, that's right. Let's get Admiral Turner on the stand. And that's precisely what the Naval or the Joint Congressional Committee did. Congressman Murphy asked Admiral Turner, Admiral Turner, did you ever tell Admiral Stark that Admiral Kimmel was getting that information, that magic information? Admiral Turner, being an honorable man, said, yes, sir, on 3 occasions. I asked Admiral Noyes, the Chief of Naval Communications, about it, and so reported to Admiral Stark. Admiral Turner went on to say that he went through this exercise on 3 occasions. The first was in January of 1941, actually 1 month before Admiral Kimmel even took the job as Commander-in-Chief of the Pacific Fleet, for a second time in July or August of 1941, and for a third time in November of 1941, all with the outrageously wrong report back to Chief of Naval Operations Stark that Kimmel had the ability and was getting magic information. Next step in the investigation, anybody? Hey, it's got to get Admiral Noyes on the stand, isn't it? Yeah, that's what we got to do. Let's ask him the $64 question. It was actually question number 64 by the Naval Court of Inquiry. Did you, Admiral Noyes, ever inform the Chief of War Plans Division, then Captain Turner, that the commander of the Pacific Fleet, Kimmel, was decrypting intelligence information of a character similar to that which you were receiving in the Navy Department? In other words, magic. Okay, how many think Admiral Noyes said yes? How many think he said no? Okay, well, here's the real answer. No. Okay, ladies and gentlemen, I can tell you after 25 years as an FBI investigator, when your investigation has reached this point, you have reached an investigative epiphany. There's nowhere else to go with your investigation. You now know why we were surprised at Pearl Harbor. Okay, this idea of magic is so important to the Pearl Harbor story. It's more important than merely excluding the man who needed to know most about this information, Admiral Kimmel. But it was also misleading to him because he thought he was receiving this kind of information. I can think of nobody better qualified to tell you about this than Admiral Kimmel's attorney, at least one of them.
On Oahu, the naval and army commanders heard nothing of the Japanese reactions to the embargoes. They were advised that although the bans were enforced, no hostile reaction by Japan was expected. Kimmel, Hanafi believes, was badly served.
Pearl have the purple machine, which was necessary to intercept the critical Japanese diplomatic messages. As a consequence, Kimmel was dependent upon Washington to get him that type of intelligence. From time to time, he received messages indicating that he was getting some of the intercepts. He expected that he would get all of that type of information which affected his disposition. He had specifically asked for intelligence information that bore upon his problem of defense of the fleet and the base, and he'd been assured he was going to get it. So the absence of the machine and the sporadic intercepts which he got lulled him into a false security in the belief he was getting the intelligence which he needed, and he wasn't.
Okay, well, let me ask you this, General Marshall. You apparently testified that you thought Kimmel was getting magic. Is that correct? Okay, now, Admiral Stark, you testified the same way. How's that possible? Okay, let's find out what the current Director of Naval History thinks about all this. That would be Admiral Samuel Cox. He delivered a Pearl Harbor Day message, and he sent it to every admiral in the United States Navy on December 7th, 2016. You can find the full version on my website. But here, in pertinent part, in very pertinent part, he said, many senior military and government officials in Washington were far more culpable of the failures that led to surprise at Pearl Harbor than Kimmel was. Culpable is another word for blamable, folks. Now, who do you think Admiral Samuel Cox had in mind when he said that? I'm thinking maybe Admiral Stark and General Marshall here before you. Okay, at any rate, that concludes my class 1. In the next class, for anybody that can make it, we're going to talk about secret intelligence, and who needs to know? Right now, I'd like to turn it over to questions and answers, which I am most eager to hear. It's my favorite part of all of my presentations because I've heard what's in the presentation before. Questions and answers are new to me, so let's go. All right. That concludes